Good to go.
Great, wonderful. Okay, I'm going to start now. Hello, everyone, everywhere, wherever you're watching us from. Welcome to today's session. I'm really delighted to be chairing David Farrier today. My name is Esa Aldegheri, and we are going to have a really interesting discussion about David's book, which is the wonderful Footprints in Search of Future Fossils. Here's my very well-thumbed copy. First of all, just a little idea of how this session's going to go. It's going to last an hour. We're going to first have a sort of short film to introduce us to the book, then some readings and discussion between me and David, and then we'll open it up to questions, which you'll be able to put in the chat, and that will be answered by David. We'll have enough time at the end. So David Farrier is a very talented man. He is professor at the University of Edinburgh of Literature and the Environment, and he's also an award-winning author. And the book, as I said, that we're going to be discussing today is his brilliant Footprints in Search of Future Fossils, which explores the traces that we as humans will leave in the very, very, very far future, addressing lots of questions in really creative and unexpected and interesting ways. And one of these key questions is, how will we be seen as ancestors by our descendants? And he covers stories and places all across the world to bring us these thoughts and these ideas. So I think without any further words from me, we shall pass straight to the short film about the book, and then to David, who will read us some of his own words.
Okay, thanks very much everyone who's joined. I'm just going to read a little bit from, and thank you Asa for introducing as well. I'm just going to read a little bit from the beginning of Footprints. This is the paperback cover. It's very much a book about how do we get a sense of what our impact is going to be in the very long term on the planet and the people who will come after us. And the challenge of seeing that, and the challenge of seeing that is really the challenge of getting our heads around deep time. So that's what this this opening couple of paragraphs is about. How do we really learn to perceive, to see deep time, which is the very long time scales of the planet itself. Treating the planet as a succession of sinks and taps as we have has kept us focused on the present, concealing the fact that we also inhabit the flow of very deep time. Earth's long pulse shapes the arc of our lives, but to see this poses a tremendous challenge to our everyday imaginations. For the most part, deep time is the strange sleep which, according to the poet Percy Shelley, wraps all in its own deep eternity. One day in November 1944, standing on a bare ocean-moulded hill in the chalk uplands of Dorset, the Irish writer John Stuart Collis sought to peer through the veil. I pressed my mind back through the bottomless abysses of time, he wrote later. The effort is beyond him, but it summons a memory of when time did briefly stand revealed. Once, in the middle of the Atlantic, looking at the horizon, I tried to imagine the space beyond it. For a second, I had a true glimpse of that space, and of the space beyond that space. And perhaps for as much as a second now, I saw the reality of 100 million years. In the ocean's immensity, the truly deep age of the earth flares for an instant with the force of a vision. In the rhetoric of ancient Greece, the term for this eruption of clarity was enargeia, and it described a speaker's capacity to peer beyond the present moment. Aristotle wrote that enargeia allowed an audience to see things occurring now, not hear of them as in the future. What Collis saw as he sought to push his mind's eye beyond the grey horizon was the enargeia of deep time, rhyming the pitch and roll of the Atlantic with an uncanny tilt of the senses. The same vision is available to us too if we choose to look with patience and care, and by it we can catch, as Shelley did, gleams of a remoter world. Or perhaps not so remote. What enargeia reveals is not always easy to face. The poet Alice Oswald's translation of the term is bright, unbearable reality. Allowing for fluctuations, today the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is around 410 parts per million, rising at around 2 parts per million per year. Climate scientists at the Australian National University recently proposed that human activity is forcing changes to the Earth system 170 times faster than natural processes. By this queasy calculus, we will see 10,000 years of environmental change in 58 years, less than a single lifetime.
Thank you. What an opening. What a way to begin. Listening to you read, one word that was very often, that there were lots of facets of this same word and this same concept, which is beyond. So both in terms of beyond our time, but also really, I think one of the things your book does so well, or you do so well in your book, is to try to help us imagine that which is actually beyond our imagining, or beyond our mind's capacity to understand this, this idea of such stretches of time within the time spans of our lives. And one of the things that again and again I would have to stop and put the book down and go, right, okay, I'm going to try and imagine this, I'm going to see if I can manage, is the idea of future fossils, because we're so used to thinking of fossils as something from the distant past. And I wondered if you would want to start by talking about that, tell us more about future fossils.
Yeah, thanks. It's so, a fossil is a trace left by something that once lived or once moved or ate or whatever, dug, buried, flew. And it's evidence of passage, of something passing through the planet. We might tend to think in the terms of the very deep age of the Earth, the billions of years that have passed, and the billions of years to come, that our presence is really just a passing one, an ephemeral one. And that has been the case largely for all of human history. We've left only the most glancing traces of ourselves in stone tools or the occasional fossilized bone and so on. But it's no longer the case. That sense of the beyond that you talked about before, of the great distance of deep time, something that's very abstract, very far away from us, is if that was ever true, I don't think it can be said to be true now, because we are leaving such a deep impression on the deep future, on the world to come. The legacies of our materials, of the kind of ways that we've burned energy and moved across the planet and built and transported materials will leave all kinds of long-lasting, deep-lying, very legible traces that will persist for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, in some cases, hundreds of millions of years. So there's a real immediacy about deep time in that, or the deep future in that respect. What we're doing now is leaving traces that will last for time out of mind. And a future fossil can be anything, really. It can be anything from a single microplastic fiber of the kind that our washing machines shed in the tens of thousands every cycle, or the remains of a vast megacity like Shanghai or Mumbai or New York or Jakarta or Tokyo. So the scale is enormous. It can be, and the thing is, we're surrounded by these things. We're surrounded by potential future fossils, from the mobile phone that I'm sure all of us have on our person or within reach right now, to a pen, to parts of a car, to the everyday substances we surround ourselves with: the brick, the plastic, the concrete, the steel, the glass. All of it is profoundly hard wearing and might leave a trace.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really good description, a trace.
Yeah.
And just walking around now in these times of pandemic living, I see so many plastic traces of coronavirus, the sort of mono-use masks and the plastic gloves. And I read with such appreciation that piece you wrote about the gloves and the hand and touch. And yeah, I mean, if I'd be happy for you to talk about that. I know it's not exactly this book, but it's still connected. But also, what are your thoughts about the traces that the traces that human reactions to this pandemic will leave in the deep future?
So I wrote a piece for Orion magazine about plastic gloves and the history of plastic gloves and the traces that they're going to leave, thinking very much about the pandemic. I think, well, first of all, if we're thinking about plastic, it's a very, we tend to think of plastic as again, very ephemeral, or something that is really just of the moment. We're so used to single-use plastics now, albeit, that is changing, we're more aware, but for decades we've been taught to think about plastic as something that really only appears to us when we use it. When you reach for that plastic bottle, or you open that tub of ice cream and then you throw it away when it's done. In fact, plastic is a deeply storied material, both in terms of the very, very ancient relic material from which it's made. The fossil fuels that are the main ingredient.
The fossil of fossils.
Well, exactly, yeah. But deeply storied in terms of the the kind of futures that they then proceed into. When you throw away a piece of single-use plastic, it has a long life ahead of it, whether that's in landfill or if it makes its way through rivers into the oceans, which huge quantities of plastic does every year, hugely regrettably. So it's a deeply storied material, and that also applies to the kind of the plastics that we've been relying upon to keep us safe in the pandemic. I forget the exact figures, but the numbers of plastic gloves that were produced annually skyrocketed into the many billions in 2020. And I think we're perhaps less concerned about what we touch than what we breathe in now with the pandemic, but still that huge quantity of single-use plastic will leave some kind of trace. There will be a trace layer, even if we discount all of the medical plastics that were incinerated. The huge amount that will have gone into landfill has the potential to leave a distinct, if very fine layer in the future fossil record. So moments like this, like the pandemic, when we find our whole sense of time turned upside down, also reach into these deep futures as well.
Yeah. I really like that phrase, a deeply storied material, because stories is, that's what your book does so brilliantly. It takes stories of places and things in them, and through those stories tries to get us to imagine this beyond imaginable. One story I saw in the news really quite recently, I think in the past week, was the story about a find in Orkney, like
Yes.
a 5,000-year-old bit of pottery where they found fossilized fingerprint. And I thought of your book because of its title, Footprints, but
Yeah.
also because of that essay about gloves, and that this was a gloveless trace. And
Yeah.
that's more like what what I can imagine as a fossil, from before.
Yeah.
But again and again, you do make the point that we are making fossils all the time, and one of the ones that most really shook my imagination was your account of fossilized cities. So the places that a lot of us live in every day and take them completely for granted, really, are on the way to become fossils. And I wonder if you want to talk a bit about that. And
Yeah,
I
sure.
love that bit of the book as well. I don't know if you want to read from it as well.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah, so, and I think, yeah, thinking about stories and touch is really central to what I was thinking about. And I very much thought about future fossils as stories told to the future. You know, when we,
Yeah.
when we manufacture these things that have the potential to leave a trace, as we've been talking about, we are kind of telling a story about ourselves to whomever might someday find these traces, whether they're in, as archaeological remains tens of thousands of years from now, or as geological remains much further into the future. And in a sense, we are, that there's a real intimacy in that. We're kind of touching the future in
Yeah.
so many ways. We're touching people who have yet to be born. We're touching their lives profoundly, because we're changing the climate.
Yeah.
As much as we're leaving, our carbon in the atmosphere is as much a kind of future fossil trace as
Right.
the remnants of a mobile phone. So, and cities, I think, are going to be, as you said, are going to be one of our most kind of richly storied and densest deposits of future fossils, and particularly megacities like Shanghai, where
Okay.
I visited in writing the book, which is based on a coastline that is both sinking and is dramatically affected by or threatened by sea level rise. So the prospect of inundation and of there being a kind of deposit of the remains of that city at some point in the future are very high. That when the sediment comes in, somewhere like Edinburgh, where we're both based, stands far less chance of being fossilized. It's on what geologists call a kind of an upward rising tectonic elevator. It's kind of slowly rising upwards and will be eroded, but a lot of that material will wash out to sea, and somewhere under the North Sea there'll be a fossil trace of Edinburgh one day in the future. But what I want to read from is sort of the beginning of a long passage in Footprints where I talk about how Shanghai Tower, which is one of the Shanghai Tower and the buildings around it in Shanghai might become a fossil. It's a much longer passage in the book. It starts from the moment of inundation and reaches into the hundreds of millions of years. But I just want to start at the beginning, when the seas begin to arrive and take us up to about 10,000 years beyond that point. For hundreds of years, as the seas creep upwards, our abandoned coastal cities will look like accidental Venices, lawless and flooded places where forgotten people squat in once elegant surroundings. Perhaps building materials will be scavenged for use elsewhere, but seawater is highly corrosive to concrete and steel. The proud skylines of Pudong and Manhattan will decay like a mouthful of neglected teeth, perhaps for as long as 1,000 years before they finally collapse. Meanwhile, thick marine mud will wash through the submerged lower floors, protecting basements, underground shopping arcades, metro lines, and everything left within them. After 1,000 years, the reinforced concrete pilings beneath Pudong may be up to 20 meters underwater, buried like the roots of impossible trees beneath several meters of mud and sand. They'll be subject to a catalogue of curious subterranean transformations. Worms and other sediment-dwelling creatures will feast on any lingering organic matter, such as paper or textiles. Waterlogged wood may begin the slow transformation into peat. Bricks will swell like sponges as they're penetrated by water and eventually crumble. But perhaps the most astonishing transformation will affect metals. iron in reinforced concrete, in steel girders, or even present as tiny components in discarded mobile phones, in laptops, or as hair clips and razor blades, will become something wondrous, acquiring a golden color as it reacts with sulfides in the sediment and transforms into pyrite, or fool's gold. In his memoir, Miracles of Life, J.G. Ballard describes exploring the grounds of a derelict casino with his father in the aftermath of the Japanese invasion of Shanghai. Everywhere gold glittered in the half-light, he writes, of the now silent casino cluttered with overturned roulette tables and fallen chandeliers, like a magic cavern from the Arabian Nights tales. At this stage, the pressure of sediment on the subterranean chambers of our buried cities will not be enough to crush them entirely. Although most will fill with sediment, some pockets might persist intact. Pyrites will form in these subsurface cavities, filling the empty space to create shining replicas of their former interiors. Any objects left within will likewise be coated with sulfides and infilled. In some cases, all that will be left are fragments, but in others, entire glittering rooms filled with false treasure will be preserved. And that's about 10,000 years into the future. Obviously, it then goes on to describe this kind of gradual compression of the city to a kind of meter-thick layer in the strata, perhaps hundreds of meters deep in the bedrock.
Yeah. It's amazing. It's really helps to what you talked about at the beginning, to peer through the veil, both of time and of very difficult to understand things for our minds that are kind of made for, I suppose, the now or the not too distant future and past.
Yeah.
Maybe that's just my mind, but I think in general as a species we do need to do that peering through the veil. But it's quite difficult. And one of the really enjoyable things about your book is how you quote from authors like you just did by Ballard, but also poets. And poetry is one of the things that as humans we need to help us peer through the veil. And some of you quoted Alice Oswald just at the beginning today, and Shelley, and you moved from Ovid to Derek Walcott, and all these poets united in a sense by this book and by this trying to peer through the veil. I wonder if you want to talk a bit more about that.
Well, I teach English literature at a university, and some people might think I've slightly stepped outside my own backyard to write a book like this that really talks about climate change and the extinction crisis and geology and the deep future and all kinds of things like that. But it just seemed to me that this is the most important story of our time. How we are changing the planet, and the kind of stories that we'll leave, the legacy that we'll leave for people who'll follow after us, which is unlike anything any other species on the planet has ever really left before. And it seemed to me that we're not short of information now about what's happening. If you look for it, the information is there. Confirming everything about what scientists have been saying for decades about the effect we're having on the planet and on ecosystems. We're not short of information, but perhaps what we need are stories. What we need are images, poems, lyrics, songs that can help us make sense of this, get our heads around the kind of time warping dimension of, a momentary action actually spooling out from our lives into, dozens of generations that will follow us. The other thing about that I think poetry does really well is it just helps us make sense of things that seem too big for our comprehension. There's a wonderful passage in Andrew Snare Magnuson's book on time and water, which I meant to bring with me and wave around because I'd recommend everyone read it, but it's wonderful.
Could you repeat that again, the name and the author?
On Time and Water by Andrew Snare Magnusson. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. He's an Icelandic writer, and it's all about glaciers and the threat to glaciers and what they've meant to him and his family. It's a beautiful book about family life and a changing planet. And he says that climate change is like it's like a black hole. He's reflecting on that a couple of years ago, the first image of a black hole was was kind of publicized.
Yeah.
And to make that image, they couldn't look directly at it, they had to look past it and like the
Right.
effects that were taking place around it. And he says climate change is like that. You can't look at it directly. It just evades our vision, our perspective.
Mm.
You have to look past it at the effects it's having. And that's what I think that's what poetry can do. It brings multiple meanings into a single framework. It helps us, to think elusively. It helps us to, look beyond the kind of that which is immediately in front of us to the things that lie behind it. It brings in subtext. Metaphors bring in multiple layers of meaning. And so I feel like these are the tools that we need to kind of read our situation critically.
Mm.
We need to be able to look past it and see the effects that it's having. That's what poetry allows us to do.
Yeah, and there's a real link as well throughout your book, the sense of what we are doing, the traces that we are leaving will be part of the future myth of our
Yeah,
descendants.
yeah.
And the sense of, poetry is closely, and some of the poets, Oswald and Derek Walcott and Ovid that I just mentioned, absolutely deal with myth. And sort of myth and the imagination, both ours now of future generations, and both the imaginations and myths of the future people of us. And I wonder if you'd like to talk about that relationship, which goes through the whole of your book, that sort of moving in between these two poles of imagination.
Well, it's kind of a mythic story, isn't it? The species that you can see it, either in the old coming out of some kind of epic narrative or some Homeric parallel, or even a kind of Old Testament kind narrative of the species that sort of changed the planet to the point where in hubris it no longer became possible to live upon it. I mean, it's a tale with epic and mythic dimensions, and we need to be careful here, because I'm very much opposed to any suggestion that we think about ourselves as a kind of godlike species. You hear that sometimes, we're terraforming now, and I think there are all kinds of very problematic, dangerous associations that come with that. But myth can still, yeah, exactly. It's not something we should necessarily celebrate, but myth is still really helpful. If not, thinking about the way in which perhaps myths will be told about, what happened in the 20th, 21st, and 22nd centuries. One of the most kind of startling aspects of that was when I was looking into what plans people are making, governments are making to store nuclear waste. This very long lasting material that will be dangerous for many generations after the waste is produced. And that in a sense, some strategies look to harness myth to make sure that warnings about the danger of nuclear waste persist long after the original, the generations that produced it have gone. In America and New Mexico, they're building a nuclear waste repository that builds it will have a kind of mythic landscape above it of enormous obelisks, covered in these kind of Edvard Munch style scream faces, warning future generations that this is a place of sickness and death.
A bad place. Yeah,
exactly. Don't come in here.
Right.
Curb your enthusiasm, kind of thing. Curb your curiosity, and so that there's a sense in which we are we're creating the conditions for new myths to be told in the future about these immense cities that we're building, or these profoundly dangerous materials that are buried deep underground, or the enormous holes in the ground that will create their own kind of geological trace in terms of open cast mines that where we've drawn out gold and other valuable minerals and so on. There are mythic dimensions to this, I think, that can help us get a sense of the scale of our impact.
Yeah, when you were talking about Shanghai, I was thinking of Atlantis, the lost
right,
Atlantis, that's that right there. And when you were talking about nuclear waste just now, I was thinking of the debate that's ongoing here in Scotland about the nuclear submarines, that the UK has its nuclear submarines in Scotland, and they're called Trident.
Yeah.
So just the whole kind of recurrence of mythology.
Yeah.
and how it helps us.
And myth is all about creativity, isn't it? Myths are constantly evolving. That was the nature of myths, in oral cultures. And
Mhm.
I think that's a really kind of hopeful thing. If we want to look at the more hopeful aspects of this, we can maybe play a part in deciding what we want these myths or these stories to be. It's not too late to think that we can turn a corner or turn the page, to extend the metaphor.
Yeah, right. And what we've been talking about, the poetry and myth and all these different ways of imagining the impossible. Um,
Mm,
Also, we can imagine ways to turn around this story
mm,
or to
mm.
modify slightly even this story.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. Change the terms of it, definitely.
yeah. Before we pass to questions, I wonder if you just want to talk a little bit about that, even just your own thoughts or from your book about, the sort of, not necessarily because we must end on a hopeful note, not that we're ending yet, but
Yes.
to change, to shift the focus and go to look at how
Yeah,
that could be shifted.
yeah. The obligatory note of hope. Yeah, no, it is important though, because I think there can be something overwhelming about thinking about deep
Well, that's it.
future stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, but for me, it always comes right back to now. It comes back to the present. It comes back to what kind of legacy do we want our actions and our lives to leave.
Mhm.
Um, and in some cases, some of the fossils that we'll leave are already kind of guaranteed. That whether Shanghai lasts for another 500 or 5,000 years, for example, it's such an immense conglomeration of synthetic materials, concrete and steel and so on. It's going to leave a trace. We can't do anything about that. I spoke to a geologist recently and I said, how can you be so confident there'll be a fossil trace of these cities? And he said, well, how would you stop it? I mean, look at them. But in other cases, there are kind of future fossils that are foretold but not guaranteed.
Mm.
Whether in terms of the quantity of plastic in the oceans,
Yeah.
how much of a trace will that leave? How much of a trace will our carbon leave? Will there be, how dense will the atmosphere get with anthropogenic carbon before we stop? And how long will that take to be weathered away? These things are not decided upon yet.
Yeah.
What will the future fossil record in terms of biodiversity reveal? Will it reveal that there was a sudden thinning of biodiversity and that that extended into a kind of mass extinction event, or will that be stopped? And will there be a sense of biodiversity recovering? These things are not decided yet, and it's up to us to determine what kind of story we want them to tell.
Yeah.
And this, you talked earlier about the pandemic, and a lot of people have been looking back at the incredible work of Jonas Salk, who came up with the smallpox vaccine and decided not to patent it, um, and
Right.
just to make it a good for the whole of humanity. And of course, that's something that the people who have things that have been responsible for designing the patents for the COVID vaccine have been resisting so far.
Yes.
But Joseph Salk was motivated by the question, am I being a good ancestor? Are we being good ancestors? That is the question for our time. Are
Yeah.
we being good ancestors, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is a really helpful question because it implies a how as well. I mean, it is a yes or no question,
Yeah.
but also,
What can we do?
yeah, how could we be? How
Mm,
could we be good ancestors? How could we go about,
mm,
being
mm.
that? So I think I'm going to invite everyone who's watching us to write up their questions if you have any in the chat box or in the Q&A box, because now is the time if you have any questions to ask them. Otherwise, David and I will very gladly keep on chatting until it's time to
Always
stop.
a pleasure.
Yeah. So I really appreciated the really practical details of every life that are
Mm,
brought into our being ancestors. So even in the wee film that we saw at the beginning, the
mm.
chickens.
Yes.
The it's just like, wow, I didn't think of it because you think of, bones left over. Well, I think of bones left over as part of middens or burial
Mm,
sites or very not ceremonial but special and ancient things.
mm.
But um, I'd love to hear more about the chickens.
Yeah.
I
Well, I
grew
mean,
up having chickens and just they're such a domestic normal thing. And yet
They are. But they will be one of a handful of species that are representative of this time in Earth's history. They appear on every continent in the world, apart from Antarctica, in vast quantities. As other kinds of biodiversity are crashing, animals that we like to eat or that live around us, so things like cows, chickens, or rats, indeed, are burgeoning, proliferating, and they will be disproportionately represented in the fossil record. So it'll be very clear what we liked to eat and what animals we preferred and those that we didn't care about, really quite damningly, I think, in the fossil record. These animals that we really take for granted and think quite comically actually are going to be representing us in quite a profound way in the future.
Yeah. Well, thank you. There's some questions coming in, so I'll just read them out loud for everyone listening as well. A question from Lydia. Thank you, Lydia. Do you think we are being good ancestors? What are the top 3 things you would change otherwise?
Wow, crikey, that's an amazing question, and fortunately a really easy one to answer. Well, maybe not, but thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think the first one is easy. It's no, I don't think we are yet. I don't think we've considered or concerned ourselves with future generations. I think you only have to look at how in the West we haven't even concerned ourselves with people living alongside us in other parts of the world, really, in furnishing ourselves with the lifestyles that we enjoy, which has been true through all of colonial history. So no, but I think there are signs of this changing. There are signs everywhere that people are becoming more conscious of the need to think about our impact on future generations. I think obviously the first thing we need to do is decarbonize. That is essential and urgent, and that needs to happen both at an individual level in terms of how each of us make decisions about how we travel, how we heat our homes, what food we consume, and so on and so forth. But structurally as well, of course. That we're all bound into structures that we can't cope with stepping outside of, really. We don't have a choice at the moment, so we need industry and governments to give us that choice. The second thing I would say is, and this is happening around the world, we need to involve future generations in our decision making. In fact, the UK Parliament is considering a future generations bill at the moment that would give, would mean that it was required for all decisions made now to involve reflection on their implications for future generations. And I think we need that to be more and more at the centre of decision making. The third thing, I suppose I would do something, I have no idea what this would be, about the terms of the debate, and try and make it less toxic, on the social media platforms that we use, where things are so polarized. I think what we need is more of opportunities to come together. Although how we do that, I'm afraid I don't really know.
Shift the imagination or the myths
that
are being used.
Yeah.
Thank you. There's another question from Joan. I hope I'm getting your name right, Joan. Thank you for the question. She's asking about the journey of writing this book and your research process. Specifically, how long were you working on this book and how widely did you range in your research? You mentioned Shanghai, but other...
So a lot of it is kind of focused on what's close to hand. So I live in Edinburgh, and I think about what's happening on the beaches nearby me, and I visit the Queensferry Crossing, one of Scotland's new bridges, to think about the future of roads. But I was also fortunate to do some travelling. I spent a sabbatical. I spent 3 months in Australia, in Sydney, and that gave me a chance to visit the Great Barrier Reef, to visit an ice core laboratory in Tasmania, to hold an ice core from Antarctica, to visit or to stand out on the outskirts of, I should say, they wouldn't actually let me in, but a uranium mine in the Northern Territory. On my way there, I got to visit Shanghai, and I also went to Finland to visit one of the nuclear waste storage facilities that they're building there, a place called Onkalo, which was fascinating. I got to visit a tunnel 500 meters deep in the bedrock. And I was very conscious of the tension in there, writing a book about leaving traces to the deep future, that involved so much travel, that involved leaving traces of my own. And it was something I thought about very carefully. In the end, I felt, I might be leaving, very unhelpful traces in the form of the, what was pumped out of the engines of the planes I was sitting on. But footprints is perhaps my opportunity to tell another kind of story to future generations as well. And it's a story I felt really passionate about telling, that I felt, was important in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That made me think about another question that I wanted to ask, but I'd forgotten to ask you, which is, in the course of your travels in these places, Australia and Finland, and many other places as well, I wonder if you would like to talk a bit about the role of what we call Indigenous knowledges in terms of framing the questions of being an ancestor or a descendant, and also the myths and the poetics of those knowledges, because here we are in Edinburgh in the new global north, and which holds valid ways of answering these questions, but there are many other valid ways. So I wonder if you want to talk about that, thinking of the Sami people and the different Aboriginal people in Australia.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the great things about myth, poetry, art is that it allows us to travel, and there are many places I got to kind of visit, as it were, by through literature, that meant I didn't have to get on any more planes in some cases, which is another kind of travel the book's engaged in. But yeah, it's it also looks at the responses of Indigenous cultures to some of the more damaging effects of human and kind of colonial influence on landscapes. I'm just looking for a page actually that I thought it might be useful to read about this, because one of the Indigenous poets that I read and I think hugely highly of, and he was very informative in my thinking about the problem of the fallout of nuclear testing, which is both hugely damaging to Indigenous populations in the regions where nuclear testing was carried out, and also, these radionuclides are going to be one of the signature traces of the Anthropocene as well. I think, marking a boundary between periods in Earth history. And
there's this fact that all iron produced after the Second World War is somehow radioactive, but previously it isn't.
Well, it's. I mean, we all. You can date. You can date people's teeth to whether they were born before or after nuclear testing, and whether they've got certain materials. So we all carry a trace that dates us in that way. These are hugely, as I said, hugely long-lasting materials and hugely damaging. And the Marshall Islands in the Pacific were the site of dozens of nuclear tests carried out by the British, by the Americans, by the French, and so on. And there's a Marshallese poet called Kathy Jetnell-Kitchener, who has written a wonderful video poem called Anointed, which I encourage you all to look up. If you look at her website, that's Kathy Jetnell-Kitchener. And the poem's called Anointed, where she visits a place on Runit Island called the Dome, where basically it went, the United States, when they'd finished their nuclear testing, because they realized all the topsoil was just completely toxic, completely irradiated, hostile to human life. They gathered it all up and deposited it in this one part of the island and built a concrete dome over the top. And this dome is still a threat to the people living nearby, but it's also threatened by sea level rise. The waters are creeping upwards, it's eroding the concrete, it's beginning to crack, and people are worried about what's going to come out. And in this video poem, Kathy Jetnell-Kitchener makes a canoe journey to it, and she stands on top of the dome, which I think is astonishingly courageous, and she
Well,
reads
yeah.
her poem, which is based on a Marshallese myth, the story of Letau. And so I'll just read a paragraph which
Thank
talks
you.
about the poem and the myth of Letau and how that helps her frame this awful legacy. In 2018, the Marshallese poet Kathy Jetnall Kitchener set out on a 4-day canoe journey to Runit Island to visit the tomb, which is the name for this, the local name for this dome.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm coming to meet you, she says in Anointed, a video poem of the journey. What stories will I find? Standing at the top of the concrete dome, she recounts the story of the trickster Letau, who received a gift from his mother, the turtle goddess, a piece of shell with the power to transform him into whatever shape he wanted, a tree, a house, even another person. But Letau uses his gift to turn himself into kindling to make the world's first fire, and gives himself to a small boy who nearly burns his village to ash. While the boy cried, Jetnall Kitchener says from the apex of the cracked concrete shell on Runit, Letau laughed and laughed. The fabric of our myths and folk tales is in us from before birth, states Russell Hoban, for whom the patterns of blue-green algae and the numerous and the numinous wings of the great nebula in Orion and the runic scroll of human chromosomes are stories. So too were the 92 straining protons in an atom of uranium. Moreover, it is certain that these won't be stories of benign creation. Lake Karachi in eastern Russia is so polluted, it's said, that standing in it for an hour would be fatal. 1,000 years or more from now, when memories of the nearby Soviet nuclear factory have evaporated, human invention will need to bend towards explaining the burning antipathy that lies beneath the lake's savage waters.
Not all myths are benign.
Not all myths are benign, no.
Yeah. There's another question from Valerie, who in 1984 says she saw an art exhibition at the Ashmolean Museum with imagined fossils of the future, like fossilized hair dryers, that really stayed with her. She still remembers it. And she's asking if you've come across this as part of your research. And also, as a second really interesting question, do you have any thoughts about a future art exhibition involving maybe international artists linked to the ideas in your book?
I didn't see that. I wish I had, but thank you for the pointer. I'll see if there's anything remaining of it online, if it's possible to view. It would be wonderful, I think, to have some kind of exhibit that drew us into thinking about how the materials we tend to overlook might have lives beyond our own, to rethink our everyday. That would be a fantastic thing to do. And if anyone there is an opportunity if you live in Edinburgh or able to travel to Edinburgh to see something like that at the moment, because the National Gallery of Scotland has an exhibition of the work of Katie Patterson, an artist whose work people might have come across in terms of Future Library, which is a project she started in 2014, a 100-year project to create a library of works that will remain unread until 2114. Each year a new writer deposits a work unread that won't be read until that date, as a kind of gift to the future. And the writers like Margaret Atwood and Ocean Vuong and Carl Ove Nausgaard have deposited works so far. Elif Shafak, wonderful writers, Han Kang. And there's an exhibition of that and Katie's other fantastic deep time-minded work at that gallery. So if you do want to check that kind of thing out, I'd recommend, now that galleries are open, which I think is true. I think that's true. Get along.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and then the idea that art can be part of the conversation about reimagining and reframing the question.
Yeah. I think Valerie's right. There's something about art that penetrates. It stays with you in a way that other kinds of information just don't.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. There's time for maybe one really quick last question if anyone wants to put it up in the Q&A. I'm aware that our time is nearly up. No, okay. So I have one quick last question, which is in terms of, yeah, because we've talked about conversation and imaginings and going beyond. What thoughts do you have about, you work for an institution which is very large, and how can the big institutions help to widen the conversations and to go across the boundaries of different ways
Mm,
of telling these stories?
mm. That's a really important question. I mean, I think, as I said, I
You
work
have
for a
2 minutes.
university. Yeah, universities have enormous good fortune in, being places where knowledge is produced and discussed and shared. And that's an obligation as well. I think we have an obligation to reach as many people as we can, to find ways to draw people into the conversations we have. I feel hugely privileged to have the opportunity to meet my students week by week and discuss these ideas with them. But what I think we have to do, and this is my short kind of more specific answer, is we have to appreciate that the stories of change, stories of climate change, ecosystem change, are not just stories that are siloed in particular knowledge
Yeah,
spheres. That this is relevant, I think, to literary studies. It's relevant to all disciplines, all
yeah.
forms of knowledge. We need these conversations to begin happening. People need to ask, what does this mean for me as a musician or a mathematician
Mhm.
or a veterinary science student? And embed that in how we think about what we do.
Yeah, yeah. Great. Thank you. I hope that means that your book will be ever more widely read by lots of different people. But for now, to close, I think, do you want to hold your book up again?
Yes.
People see its beautiful latest iteration. Thank you. And I think it's time for us to say thank you to everyone who's joined us from wherever you are. And I've really enjoyed this conversation, and may it be one of many about your really beautiful and important book, David. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Fab. Great. I'm going to end it here then. Thanks for that, guys. It's great.